brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village at Britain, the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
Okay, guys, let's go ahead and start. We are, believe it or not, on episode 54, and that's insane if you ask my opinion. I can't believe we've come that far. When we were starting, that seemed to be highly unlikely, but here we is, and we're just beginning of the long journey, hopefully. So episode 54, and it all started with the idea of talking about hospitality, right? And we are going to explore the triad, because in reality, hospitality is made up, this is my interpretation, is made up of really three different factors. And that is the triad of the hospitality is food, sharing of the food, sharing of gifts exchange, and bathing or cleansing ceremony of some sorts. And that's something that I just want to throw out there as kind of our beginning idea, kind of our roadmap. And we have already talked pretty heavily about hospitality as such. We've also talked about the food, the significance of food. 1 second, let me write this down. In this particular exchange, and if we're just going to refresh just a little bit, food is significant because consumption, being either consumed or consuming something, oftentimes is a form of initiation. Through consumption or being consumed, you basically, it's a death and a rebirth ceremony, right? And so that's something that is very, very important in this conversation, because really, in the end of the day, everything that has to do with hospitality has to do, as we remember, with things like hostility, strangers, scary people, the other side of reality. So we've talked about the food, and I'm going to talk a lot today about the gifts. And when we talk about gifts, it's really hard to not talk about bribes at the same time, which I think is an interesting side tangent. And if we have time, I will just say a couple words about bathing as a part of the hospitality tradition and tell you a really scary story about bath houses. Modern, scary story. So we talked about it a bunch last time, and the idea of hospitality, the big concern about it, let me switch my view. Apparently I have everybody view on. The idea of hospitality is really, when we go to the very basics of where that comes from and why we have so many rituals around hospitality, it's the idea of safe world, people's world, human world, and the other world. Because as we can imagine, in the very beginning of time, when people first started distinguishing themselves from nature, the boundary, the threshold between us and that other, unknown, terrifying, consuming, dangerous environment where wild animals roam, where wilderness exists, and where spirits, ghosts, the spirits of the dead, and all the other things that potentially can harm us people. Now, as we all know, we've talked about it before, every community, especially in the beginning of time, thought of themselves as the people and everyone else as not people, not humans. In almost every language, the word for, let's say, the word Slavyani, I know that in English it transmutated to mean slaves due to a bunch of medieval economy issues and sales of people. But the word Slavs actually comes from to speak, people who speak. The ancient Greeks talked about strangers as barbarians because they can't really speak. They go brr, 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 right? But in a lot of other languages, just the name for themselves, the self-identification name means humans, people. Everyone else is not people. So the best way to know who is really people, right? That would be your relatives, people you are actually related to. And But these newcomers, these strangers, on the one hand, they're really good thing because they bring new things with them. They bring new blood. They allow you to extend your horizons besides your little forest, your little cave, your little village. On the other hand, they're potentially terrifying. In a lot of cultures, especially I know Slavic cultures early on, they practiced cleansing rituals. For example, if a person traveled outside of a village for an X amount of time for trade or anything like that, once they returned for several days, they would be completely isolated from the society while the society checked that it was still the person who left originally, that some spirit did not take over their form, that this was basically not an infiltration by the evil outside forces kind of operation, right? So how do we make stranger one of us? Well, we make stranger one of us by adopting them, by making them actually pseudo family, extended family ties. One of those ways is through consumption of food, sharing of food, which kind of brings us to kinship in a lot of cultures. Another way would be through sharing of things. And that's where our idea of gift giving comes from, right? So in very early human societies, people did not have property, right? We didn't have capitalism. We didn't have inalienable private property. We had a small band of people and everything that they owned. For example, if I'm going to sit down and make me a spear, right? It's going to be me with my hands, with that piece of wood, who's going to pick out that piece of wood and personally make that spear, right? So that spear is in a way an extension of me. I've put in my thoughts, my time, my spirit, my energy, my soul into this object. So therefore that object becomes a part of me. So the idea of exchanging things that are part of you with this other person is very similar to sharing food. You giving them a piece of your soul, and the idea of return gift in a lot of early societies is the idea of them giving you a piece of their soul. You know, today we see echoes of that when parents go, oh my gosh, she drew such a cute little picture for me. It's a, you know, like when a kid makes a, like, I don't know, little statue for you or something else, it's because it's from the heart, right? That's the same concept. It's the idea that when you invest yourself into making of something, that something becomes imbued with your spirit. It carries a part of yourself. And so that was a way of adopting, of making that stranger a part of the family. It was a way of establishing pseudo relationship, pseudo blood relations, if that makes sense. Is everybody on the same page so far? So another aspect of that is memory. For example, my mom has had a really wonderful lady who was really kind of almost like a second mother to her. Bella Ivanovna was her name. She was a much older lady. And last time I was visiting back home, I was visiting their house, and Bella Ivanovna, she must have felt something, but she had this little electric teapot. It was a porcelain electric teapot. And she was like, I want to give you something. I want to give you something. Take this, you know. And it was just a teapot that she was using, that she valued, that she bought a long time ago. Just keep it. And then she passed away shortly thereafter. So that teapot to me now is not just some stupid teapot I can plug in, which I can go to any Walmart and buy another one off. It carries a part of her. It's a part of her memory. So in that sense, that idea of the spirit of the person being a part of that very genuine gift kind of transfers even onto things that are not personally made with our own hands, but it lingers there. The biggest thing about sharing of the objects today, when we talk about material culture, the culture of consumption, the thing is, in those societies, objects were not material. They were spiritual, first and foremost. Today, when we think about a famous painting by, I don't know, Picasso, or I don't know, Dali, or Leonardo da Vinci, right? First thing that when we say, oh, it's a priceless painting, we're thinking about figures, you know, how many zeros on the end of that auction. Rather than even in medieval times, even as recently as 19th century, person would look at such a work of art and think of its value not in, you know, dollar signs, but in contribution to the human culture as a whole. And that was the value that people placed on things back then. The value was not monetary. The value was not even substantial. It wasn't, you couldn't exchange these things for anything valuable because there's things that you cannot exchange. You cannot trade your, well, according to some Christian stories, you can sell your soul, but in reality, things like honor, things like spirit, things like memory, things like love of a child, right? You cannot trade that for any sort of monetary price. And so the exchange of those items became a way of building relationship bonds across community. In a lot of cultures, actually, those trading of things was very similar to the law of hospitality, which was actually, for example, judicially practiced in Rome, ancient Rome, to where when you officially state, I'm extending hospitality to this family, right? And it becomes very similar to blood, I'm saying, what's the word for it? Named brother sort of bond. Or the ritual when two kids hold up hands, when they cut their hands and they hold and mix blood, it became a way of almost marriage. Does that make sense? Not actual marriage through, man and woman, but you adopt them into your family, and now your door is always going to be open to them, and they can feel themselves at home in your space, and your spirits will accept them, and vice versa. And the same was with the exchange of gifts. When you traded gifts with someone, that meant you're brothers now, right? Think about all the fantasy books and Viking sagas when people traded swords. Think about friendship bracelets in our culture. That's a way of establishing pseudo-familiar relationships. And so, go ahead.
Talking about it, in Roman times and around the like biblical times, basically, when somebody was adopted into a family, they were part of that family, had the same rights and responsibilities as a blood relation. It's not like that in Western culture, like with kings and queens. If it's not an official, like if it's a child out of wedlock, they can't inherit. But or if a child's adopted, they can't inherit. But in the Roman times, which is where we learned in our theology, when you're adopted, you're in.
Absolutely. But think about, why is it that a child out of wedlock cannot inherit? A child out of wedlock cannot inherit. It becomes a matter of legality, inheritance, and transference of valuables, along the family line. It's a matter of inheritance. For the same reason, for example, why the idea of having multiple wives was so heavily prosecuted and is so heavily prosecuted in the U.S. is because it becomes a legal mess. But that's an economic value. But like you said, and when you exchange gifts, you effectively adopt that person into the family. Now you've traded bits of soul, right? And so now they are one of you. They are no longer the other, the monster. They are known from beyond the hill. They're now a part of your own clan, your family, and it's a blood relationship in a way, right? And so it's a code. The exchange of gifts in a lot of cultures is also a code language, but I will get to that. The idea was gifts. Again, like I said, objects are not material. They represent pieces of soul. They represent pieces of spirit. They represent pieces of the ancestral tree in a spiritual sense. And because of that, the idea of gift, return gift, and re-gifting was and still is so essential to these societies. The idea is because these items are symbolic representations of energy, of magic, right, of goodwill. They need to keep moving throughout the communities. They need to keep circulating around the communities. And so it is why it is so important to return the gift. It's not a matter of, okay, you're going to give me a pair of shoes and I'm going to give you a hat. You're going to give me a sword and I'm going to give you my rapier, right? It's not that. Well, I'm trying to very carefully distinguish the economic value of trading valuable objects. For example, I give you 3 bushels of wheat and you go sleep with me, like the Egyptian prostitutes, right? Or I give you 3, barrels of beer and you give me 6 cows. Okay, I doubt anybody would make that trade, but the beer might be very good, who knows? But the idea, it's not that sort of like, it's not tit for tat. It's not valuable. It's the idea of, this is energy. This is an impulse. This is reality. It's magical. And it needs to keep circulating. That's why the idea, if you get a gift, you need to return. Oh, there's our Nathan. You need to return the gift, not because you need to repay that person back in kind. It's because that's the way of things. It's how it's done. This energy cannot stagnate. If it stagnates, then you're kind of like sitting on the goodwill that belongs to all the people. So for ancient people, and this is again, a lot of this is pulling from some studies, but some of it is my own personal conclusions I want to kind of talk about. So for a lot of people, it was a way of creating connections, networks, right? It was a way also, the very act of exchanging gifts, and this now I'm quoting directly from some famous studies, is the idea that if a person, let's say, back in 19th century, an explorer, let's say from England, comes from some faraway island. He looks nothing like the people on that island. Like, let's say he has blonde hair or he has or red hair. They have dark curly hair. They dress differently. They talk differently. How are they supposed to know that this visitor is a human being, right? For all they know, he's a demon out of hell. Or maybe he is, I don't know, some strange breed of crocodile, right? The way that you identify yourself as a human being, that's one of the rituals that identifies you as a human being. Once that ritual of gift exchange has been completed, you're now seen as a person. It was very essential in recognizing those people who live beyond the hill, who may not look like us and not dress like us, but they know what the human ways, they know the people's ways, the sacred ways, and therefore they self-identify as a people, as a human being. So it was not only a way of establishing connections between individuals, because there was no such thing as individual per se early on. It was more of a communal thing. It was a way of establishing connections between communities. And that one thing led to another. Now, again, I want to distinguish between the idea of economy as far as valuable items traded for valuable items, and the idea of symbolic representations of goodwill traveling around. And so that's kind of the idea of hospitalities and gift giving. The exchange of gift giving leads to basically kind of establishing of pseudo blood ties, which in turn leads to connections between communities. It leads to agreements between communities, for example, peace agreements or trade agreements later on, and it allows the development of the society. Later on, the Roman law was in a lot of ways used that as a foundation for some of their making of actual official agreements with different other states, nations, and so forth.
I was going to talk about the natives in the northern Canada. They have a very, probably not just northern Canada, they have a very formal gift-giving system to restore order and balance in the community. And it's certain types of gifts and a certain color packaging and so on. That's all, and it's built into the system. Like if you do something wrong to somebody, you can reestablish a relationship with the right kind of gift. I don't know. I'd see if it's similar where you are, but that's certainly the way it is up here.
It's an extension of where I'm at. Let me just finish the thought, and then David wants to jump on. So in a lot of these societies, and I will move on to a different type of gift giving. Right now, I'm talking about the gift giving from the aspect of building connections, because I want to talk about different things. But so in this case, the act of gift giving works as almost like either the glue, the cement that holds various societies together, a way of recognizing that you are human and that you are somebody I can come to an agreement with, and also as a lubricant for economic exchange. Later on, we will be talking about some of different types of gift giving. People would travel very far to perform this ritual of exchanging gifts, and at the same time, they would bring items with economic value to sell. So in a way, it seems like economy, the actual fact of trading and exchanging monetary, valuable, not monetary, but material goods, was built on top of the original spiritual practice of gift giving. So that's the part that I wanted to talk to as far as the connections.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about. That's the system. I mean, in the Western culture, we don't really have that understanding of gift giving. For us, it's more of a monetary thing. But certainly in Native culture, it's part of the culture. It's restoring balance, restoring the community. Becoming part of one.
There's a couple of anthropological viewpoints on this. In our earliest times, when we were mostly small bands of hunters and gatherers, there's an outside reciprocal gift giving and there's an inside. There's an internal and there's an external. There's an open and closed type system. And probably one of the first things we did, because there's the taboo on close incest is almost always, this is Levi Strauss, is you start getting mates from other groups. And there's not a tit for tat exchange, but there's an expected payback over time. It's not really monetary. The same thing with a family within a band. You give, it is reciprocity, but it's not a on the spot exchange.
Okay, so the second part, and this is, I don't think I'm the first person who invented this, but I kind of want to label this section costly signaling. Of course, I'm sure a lot of you know what costly signaling means, right? But costly signaling, for example, is a classical example is your peacock, with gigantic feathers that are completely not helpful for any sort of survival. But the idea is that you are showing to everyone out there that you're so cool and you're so fit that you can overcome that ridiculous tail that's dragging on the ground and still survive and still be an awesome mate, right? Or a dude who goes out and buys a Ferrari when he only is making double-figure salary, right? That's the idea that you are showing off your over fitness by complicating your life, right? And that's what I kind of want to call this section. So that's the idea as gifts, as represent a couple of things. First of all, they're representative of fitness, in other words, luck, or as it was called in Viking Scandinavian countries, the charisma, right? Charisma or luck is something that a leader has that makes him a leader. Just like captain of a pirate ship is only going to be the captain of the pirate ship for as long as he's successful. The moment you lose one battle, if you Viking Conan, or if you make wrong decision as a Kazakh leader in the back, or as a Conan, the gods have abandoned you, your luck is out the window, nobody wants to follow you. So in a way, why does a Conan need to be rich? Why do they continue trying to acquire more gold, more gold, more gold? In a lot of cultures, the leader of a group is not the guy with the most bling. The leader of the group is the guy with no bling. Because why the heck do I need bling? I can go get me more, right? I'm badass enough, I'm tough enough, I'm lucky enough, and I'm capable enough. I'm going to be able to acquire more, more, more. And the idea is that when you have people handing out things to their close members of their, what's a herd, for lack of a better word in English language, rings or golden items or grivnas to your closest warriors, because right in early kind of warrior society, you had the band leader or Conan or whatever you want to call that military leader person, and then his closest circle of warriors who are pretty much his equals, and he's only the leader because he is more lucky, more successful, more capable. You're not handing out monetary wealth to your peeps. I mean, on the one hand, yes, you are handing out monetary wealth, but on the other hand, you're handing them an object that is touched by your luck, by your charisma, by your favor from the gods. So when you see, and I'm not talking about late medieval rulers who are giving, here's a ring of my finger. It's an echo of that tradition. But the original point of that ring of my finger was not so much in monetary value as in, I got enough, I can share. And I want to share with you guys my own personal sadness, okay? Remember when the movie Beowulf with Angelina Jolie came out? And I was so stoked. I was like, finally, they made a movie, a real movie, Hollywood movie, based on something historical, right? I watched the first probably about 5 minutes of that movie. I got up, stormed out of the theater and cussed them, and I'm cussing them to this day. I want to show you the moment where I said, screw you, screw your complete twisted misrepresentation of a very classical foundational story of Anglo-Saxon culture, and where I decided that censorship on things like making movies out of classical foundational stories is much required in the world. I'm going to show you that episode real quick if you don't mind. Because that made me so angry. I don't think I have words enough to describe that even still. That's Hrothgar. He's naked, but never mind that.
Joy and fornication.
And that right here is where I said, excuse my language, bad words starting with various F and other unnecessary letters. And I stormed out of that theater. And I think for that scene right there, I don't even care I don't care about Angelina Jolie. I don't care about any of that. That scene right there just turned the entire story, the entire spirit of Beowulf, of the society that Beowulf reflects, of the society that Tolkien reflects in his A Lord of the Rings, right? The idea what those rings represent, the idea that a leader of a group like that would treat his brothers the way that they just depicted in that movie, that he would, like he would do rabid dogs, throw out a handful of bones onto the floor to his herdmen, is so fundamentally wrong and misrepresentative of the kind of relationship those people had, the kind of respect they had for one another, and the kind of reverence each one of those leaders of those herds treated his brothers who would be defending his back in the next battle was, excuse my language, that shit makes me sick, okay? That's my little rant right there. So I'm going to stop, see if anybody else wants to say anything.
So one of the things oftentimes actually not oftentimes, but when I take my trips to Africa and I'm out in the field, the crew is paid out individually, one by one, and and there's a little bit of a kind of a ceremony, end of a like campaign well done, job well done. However, individually, it's all done behind closed doors, and they're paid out individually and with great respect. And the complete antithesis of the scene that you just showed.
Right. And I think David wanted to jump on real quick, so I'm going to silence myself.
In the time of Attila, part of the reason that Attila had to get so much gold was you've seen the gold and garret brooches and things that are sword buckles and all kinds of things like that. He, in 443 or 447, he got 6,000 pounds of gold. But by this time, he's the head of a huge collection of not only Hunnic warriors, but Germanic warriors that expect that they have to feed their war bands. And so it was very much, and it was just like Nathan said, it was individual relationships based on respect that caused him to, what one of the historians called it, his diplomacy was Rome was systematic extortion, but it was to feed that whole, right. So that's all I had to say, but yeah, that was horrible. Yeah, there are some good Beowulf movies out there. One was shot in Iceland. What's the name of it?
Beowulf and Grendel.
Beowulf and Grendel, yeah, I think. But there are some good ones out there, but that one wasn't particularly.
Yeah, I just call it a cultural context of acceptable behavior, trying to get that right.
Right.
I just think that people who go out there and try to shoot films, because I'm going off on a side rant. Okay, 99% of modern American youth has not read Beowulf, not only in its original writing, but in any form at all. They have no flipping idea what that is about, okay? That is a foundational work for the entire culture we all live in, whether or not we are part of it ancestrally or not. Anglo-Saxon culture is such that is the oldest written work of literature. Okay, so you are a movie producer. You're going to represent this to teenagers who ain't gonna ever read it. And the only way they will ever even know who those people were is by watching that movie, right? And you're gonna go take a beautifully written poem, which already has all the plot lines you need in it, and you're gonna rape it like that. That made me, oh, the scene after that, when he lays his queen out in front, never mind, I don't even wanna go into that. I mean, to me, that's perversion in the worst sense of the word. And there's nothing sexy about that kind. And Angelina Jolie does not make it any better. I'm done with that rant now.
I was just going to use the word perversion. Incidentally, there's a TV show that did an episode and they said it in my area, Black Forest. And I was all excited, like, oh, this will be great. It's a great place to shoot a kind of horror theme. It's like, wow, fail. That's what Hollywood is good at doing, is perverting stories and landmarks, places, you name it.
Right. Exactly. So kind of continuing with this thought of costly signaling, showing your success and your value and your capability, and also spreading, back to that subject of spreading a symbolic, again, those rings that are handed out by the leader at the beginning were not monetary value. They were parts of his aura, of his soul, of his success. You sharing your success with your peeps. Right. So, for example, even today in Caucasian cultures, where we're talking about the Caucasus peoples, right? To this day, if you walk into a house of a friend who happens to be from the Caucasus and they catch you standing there looking, let's say, at a vase they have on their shelf, right? Or even if they are dirt poor, even if that vase was their favorite grandma's only remaining memory, they will take that vase and give it to you and be offended if you don't take it. Because it's a part of that same idea. I can get more. I'm good. I want a part of me to be with you, right? Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that are fairly well known. I'm not going to stay on them very, very long, but I think I should at least mention these people, because these people contributed significantly to the whole idea of what modern science, anthropological, ethnographic science knows and understands about the idea of gift giving. So the story of how kula, the idea of kula, was discovered, right? I'm sure you've heard that term before. So this gentleman was an anthropologist who wanted to go, ethnographer, who wanted to go out and study peoples in faraway lands, right? And so first, when he arrived on the island in the Western Pacific Ocean, he arrived there like people back then did. He was wearing white clothes, living in a proper gentleman's home, and he was trying to talk to these foreign, strange, these peoples, you know, because he wanted to learn about their customs and traditions and religion and all the interesting things that ethnographers wanted to know, right? And so he was living in this beautiful house. I'll go to the picture a little bit later. And that was completely unlike what they lived in. And he was dressed weird. Actually, I'm going to skip forward one more, show you what he looked like. So imagine this. You're this person, right? Normal person, you're people. And then comes this. He's dressed funny. He doesn't know anything about how to survive here. For example, they had some pigs they were feeding. He'd be like, hey, can you explain to me the meaning of this action that you're taking right now? And the guy would be like, I'm feeding my pigs, right? And he's like, well, what are you saying to a pig? And they look at him and be like, I'm saying, piggy, eat the food, grow fat, you know? Because to them, he was a weirdo. He was not integrated to the community. So eventually he said screw it to everything he was taught in college, and he went and lived with these people and figured, okay, they're going to think I'm a complete weird moron, but at least they're going to see that I'm trying. This is a picture where he was a little bit more effective and partially integrate into the community, and maybe they will let me in. And that's what happened, right?
Malevsky, right?
Yeah, Malevich. I want to make sure I'm pronouncing the last name correct. Malinovsky. It's total blank on the first name. I'll remember it in a second. Anyway, so in the process of gathering all these amazing ethnographic information, and he of course has a book published, he noticed the weird thing, and I'm just going to go over this really quickly. He noticed that these people who live on these islands from different groups and tribes, who oftentimes were in a conflict, military conflict, like actual serious standoff with one another, were constantly exchanging these types of things. These are some examples, you know, a bracelet and a necklace, right? That had no value, and at the same time they were priceless. These things could not be traded for anything else. You could not trade that for a pig. You could not trade it for any food. You could not trade it for a wife. You could only trade a bracelet for a necklace, necklace for a bracelet. And yet these things were priceless, right? And this circulation of these gifts, they went around the circle between island to island, tribe to tribe, even in the middle of animosity. And every person who traded these items, like I was saying earlier, would be establishing their relationship, this kind of connection. And it was very important to at least once a year, for example, once a year, whatever proper term, to get to your brother that lives on 15 islands over, and 17 days sailing or rowing or whatever it was, and return that gift. You always had to return these things. Some of these had higher value than others. Some of these, for example, may be believed to come from the ancestor heroes, the first settlers or whatever. And they would be priceless, but the idea was not to keep these, not to collect these, it was to continue passing them on. And the interesting thing, when, let's say, an islander from one island would undertake that really long journey to another one, he would come there not for any other purpose, but specifically to return the gift, right? But when he or she would be returning the gift, they would bring with them also the trade goods that actually did have economic monetary value. So the very act of needing to keep that energy flowing was what allowed the trade, the economy, the actual material exchange to be built on top of the spiritual exchange tradition. So that was those things were called Kula, and that was when he published his, I believe it was 1922. This was kind of a sensation. Of course, all the other anthropologists started looking at other peoples who were doing that. And so another very famous person, Moss, published another interesting study, not very good picture, but of course, and I'm sure a lot of you knew the idea, and this is of course North America, if I'm correct, and that's the idea that in certain societies, people would go out of their way suddenly, again, tribes, groups of peoples living together, some related, some not, some at peace, some at war, and suddenly one person would invite everybody over, name somebody guest of honor, I'm very much simplifying and summarizing, and throw a feast with everything he had, everything, to the last drop of food, to the last drop of tools to be able to acquire more food and give everything away. And the more, the better. To the point where that person, when all was said and done, would literally be starving. But the person in whose name that feast was thrown, or who was named the guest of honor, would then throw that same feast, not because he was trying to pay back to the person who gave these things away. That person didn't even necessarily get invited, but it went back out in community. And this was not the idea of redistribution of the goods. So this is not different when we were talking about the Nards in the Caucasus, right? But they would feast and eat all the cows, all the sheep, and everything that they had, and then starve to death, right? This is the idea of costly signaling. That's my supposition. The idea that I am going to, it's a sacred ritual. It also became a way of, it wasn't just a way of building familiar relationships between this family and that family. It became a way of cementing peoples with peoples, to the point where people, when they had nothing else to give away, like they only had the house over their head left, they would burn the house down, right? We will go into the next section about a little bit more about that destruction of wealth or of goods. To the point when they had nothing to give, let's say the person who was the guest of honor at one of these kind of celebrations, he had nothing else, he would start giving away his children and his wife, okay? Or other family members. Now that flows over into the next subject, but this was the idea of total giving. So on the one hand, this falls into my section of costly signaling, because this would become a competition. Who can give away more? Who is more selfless? Who is more dedicated to making everybody happy and leaving nothing for themselves? By the way, that also remains in Russian culture to this day. If we get it, to this day, the idea of giving the last shirt of your back to somebody else is considered to be, I don't know, Russian trait, whatever you want to call it. I don't know how much you got all those movies in the 90s, early 2000s about the Russian gangsters. I'm sure you guys seen them. That group of people, that that social class that existed only between 1992 and 2002 or something like that, and went extinct since, they were called the New Russian. So, when the Soviet Union collapsed, these were people who were best hustlers of them all and craziest of them all. So they just jumped in and became capitalists in a heartbeat, right? They had no brakes. They could kill you at a moment's notice for no reason at all. Or alternatively, they could meet a homeless person on the street and give them the last shirt of their back, right? And it's all seen, again, when these people were asked why they're doing that, they would say, well, just because that's what you do. That's what it means to be a person, right? I'm stopping, seeing if anybody has anything to say.
Yeah, they still definitely do that kind of thing up where I am. The natives here had a thing they call the Mooside Gathering, and they invite people from all over, including non-natives. And they have a feast at the end of each day, and at the end of the weekend, they have what they call a giveaway, where they have people gather in a big circle, and all the citizens, I mean the local native people, they just start handing out stuff and say thank you for coming. And this is all free. Like they'll ship you down there by boat, they'll feed you, and then they'll give you a present. And it's just part of the. Why do they do it? It's part of the culture. It's just the way it is.
Right. And I want to make a distinction. This is not the same as a millionaire who is donating money to charity, because today in our modern society, that millionaire is not donating money to charity because it's the sacred thing. He or she is doing it because they're going to get a tax cut, right? There's monetary value to the action. In this case, again, there's not an economic value attached to the action. There's not a rational value from the sense of modern civilized person. It is the lubricant that makes the society run. It's just what you do. It's the sacred thing.
It's building the society. It's got nothing to do with gain, money gain. It's just bringing peace and harmony and togetherness everywhere. And that's the idea.
And consolidate.
It's the glue that builds. It's what allowed human society to exist. That's the price for humanity. It's the price for having a society at all. Without it, once the tradition dies, society starts breaking up. And it's very instinctual in us. I mean, think about like how many times a little kid will take their favorite doll and be like, you know what, take that with you, right? How many times have you had a situation where just a person you kind of sort of know, and you have something really precious? I mean, I've had a situation with a diamond ring, okay? When a girl that I met for the first and last time in my life, I just gave it to her because she really liked it and it made me feel good. So there's an evolutionary component to that, right? When our cat or dog brings a dead bird and lays it at our feet, it's reciprocity in vampire bats, for example, who feed each other. But reciprocity is different from this kind of need to give, because we get endorphins when we give. It makes us feel good. And without that oil, without that lubricant, without that glue to hold society together, the society starts falling apart from a cohesive network of people who are related to each other by magic, by blood, by pseudo blood ties, into individuals who sit alone, each in their room, and a city with billions or millions of people, and nobody to talk to, and nobody they can ever go to and say, brother, uncle, sister, cousin, help. And I think that, it's the same reason why I get uncomfortable when an electrician working on my house will not take a glass of water. It's those very instinctual ties that connect human society together. And when we start devolving them and throwing them out the window, it's the very fabric of society, the very thing that made humans, their ability to interconnect, that is thrown out the window and traded for monetary value. When Picasso is not worth something because it's a precious painting, because it has value as a work of art, as a thing that influenced and moved the society, when it becomes valuable because it costs this much at the next auction, right? And we just have a couple more minutes. Does anybody else want to say anything else about gift giving? I want to finish just a couple more things about it, and then really quickly talk about bathing as a part of the triad. Yeah, David wants to jump on. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I was thinking that the gift giving in some cultures is amazing. Like when we moved up here, my ex and I, she didn't want to bring her car, so she just gave it to somebody, just gave her car away. And that's, I mean, for our Western culture, we're all money based, and she wasn't. Like she figured out she'd get another car eventually. It'll happen, and that's just the way it is. You just give something of great value away.
Yeah, that's something that I have seen before too. My old high school buddy, one day, a member of his church just asked them, it's like, hey, could you use a spare car? We have a spare car. And they just gave it to them. And officially, you have to put a monetary price on a title. So they wrote in $1 or whatever it was. But I was basically given the trailer that I lived in. It was just a gift of, mutual respect, you could say.
Right.
I wanted to make another point to what you said, Chris. In the Americas, the concept of private property, especially land, in all even the great civilizations of the New World didn't have private individual own of the land. They had clan use of the land. So the New World has a very different perspective. There are a couple of exceptions to that, but generally, it was almost blasphemy to think you could actually own something that you actually belong to rather than the other way around.
Yeah, I like that sentiment, actually, David. I always thought it was interesting because it's like, oh, that's foolish. Own land? No, you walk on land.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting when the Western culture arrived in British Columbia. And the native people, of course, were doing potlatches and whatnot. And then the banks came along and offered to loan money and, explaining that system. So the banks are moving in. And, of course, the native people happily borrowed money, gave a potlatch, gave everything away, and then declared bankruptcy because that was a legal thing that they learned. And they would do it over and over again. And eventually, it's back in the 30s, I think, eventually the government banned potlatches, and they've only been legal again in the last 20 years or something, because they were actually banned because they kept going broke and declaring bankruptcy and starting all over again. So like a native culture and the Western culture, yeah, they had to figure out how each other worked, I think.
Right. So since I promised in my
quick
go ahead please.
comment, if you can hear me. So in there, what I'm picking up on an underlying theme for tonight is it's a worldview that it's an abundance. It's a worldview that's or an outlook, a way of looking at the world that's based upon based upon abundance or scarcity. And the abundant worldview says there's plenty to go around, and there's no matter how much I give away, because I live in such a certain way, it will come back to me. Whereas the scarcity worldview says, oh, there's only there's not enough. There's only so many donuts,
Right.
and so I need to collect and hoard them all. And land is a great example. There's only so much. Equate land to donuts. There are only so many. There's only so much to go around, and that's a scarcity mindset.
Nathan, I would say on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's usually, what's funny is the people who most, what's the word for it? Generous, oftentimes are the least wealthy.
Exactly, and that's part of what I'm getting at. Yes.
Right. So just to clarify, the idea is again, we're not placing value on the actual how much bushels of wheat I can or whatever I can buy, clams I can buy with this item, but what it represents my worth as a person. It's how other people view. It's my value to myself. It's my value in the society. It's my value. It's my status, but not just prestige. It's status. It's how much do others respect me. For example, in the case with the kula, right? Those are the things people would never keep this kula, right? It's not something that you take home and never give away again. It's respect. It's kind of like Olympic prize, right? Once you're given that medal or champion belt in any kind of competitive sports, right? Once you're the champion, even though that belt passes on, that title is with you for life. It's a representation of what your worth is, not in monetary sense, but in human sense. Okay, very quickly, not to keep everyone horribly over time, I wanted to talk about bribes. We all been hearing forever and keep hearing and will never stop hearing about fighting corruption, anti-bribe laws, fighting corruption. I want to talk a little bit about three different concepts, okay? I want to talk about the idea of gift, giving, the idea of feeding, and I will explain to you what that means in a second, and the idea of bribe as it once upon a time existed in Western society and still exists in the Eastern society very much so, and where the borderline is between these three very different concepts. Now we see that gifts as such, right? Gifts is something that is given without any expectation. It's not reciprocity per chance, per se. It's not, I'm going to give him that and one day he's going to give me this, right? It's not the idea of, oh, I have this excess junk clothing, I'm just going to give it out rather than throw it away. It's a selfless act of, without expecting anything in return, passing on the goodwill. It's a blessing. It's a material blessing, right? So when you give a gift, judicially speaking, you are not expecting anything. You're just giving the gift, right? Now, the bribe, the difference between the bribe and the gift is when you give a bribe, you're giving it with an expectation of getting something back. It is straight up a payment, right? Always the difference between a gift may be open or it may be kind of something that happens between just the people who exchange the gifts, right? A bribe is always secret. And when you give a bribe, it is a payment for services that are going to be performed. And in a modern sense, a bribe is, it's illegal because it's oftentimes illegal or at least questionable services that a person of power is going to perform for the giver, which makes it extremely difficult in Eastern societies to distinguish between a gift and a bribe. For example, if your kid is going to school 2nd grade, right, and you give the kid's teacher a box of candy, are you bribing her to give him better grades or not, right? If you go to an office and you give the clerk or the secretary there flowers, not in a courting sort of way, but or thank you card, is that a bribe because you expect them to process your documents quicker? Or is that a gift? That's a very fine line. What makes it even more complex in Slavic, in Russian society, this is more recent. This also existed in all other societies, the concept of feeding. And that is when there was no such thing as centralized salaries, right? So when state was first getting formed, for example, I'm a Konung, I have conquered these lands and I have this village, that village, this village. I need people to sit in each village and collect debts, taxes, whatever, oversee the situation. I don't have cash to be paying them all up, but there's no such thing as paid salaries, right? So you would assign them feeding. That's how ownership of serfs, that's how the idea of land owning nobility, knights in Western Europe originally happened. This territory and these people are given to you. You perform services for them, and in exchange, they're paying you. Basically, it's no different than getting a salary, but you're not getting a salary from above. It's the people that you're servicing are returning the favor and supporting you. Today, that sort of practice is still seen in some church and religious communities, where monks, whether Catholic or Buddhist or any other sort of religious group, either monks or priests or cult members, they don't get salary. They have nothing to report for taxes because the village where they live, they bring them, chickens, they bring them eggs, they bring them a little bit of bread, fabric, that sort of idea. That's the idea of feeding. And one of the reasons why the idea of bribes and corruptions is so mind-boggling to the Western peoples today who think very rationally is because, for example, in former Eastern Bloc countries, there's a very much inside each person's head, there's a convoluted intermingling between the three concepts. It's natural for people. For example, if a person is named a boss of a factory, the factory workers, not because they're trying to elicit anything necessarily from their supervisor, they're going to be bringing them feeding. Hey, I baked some cookies, boss. Would you like some? On the one hand. On the other hand, giving flowers to your kid's teacher is a sign of respect, right? That's the reason why leaders throughout history, Genghis Khan, all the other great military conquerors, valued gifts, not dues, not taxes. That's different, that's monetary. But the idea that you, from the bottom of your heart, are giving something precious to them. And that line between the gift of respect the idea of feeding as a social contract, and what's illegal, basically fee for secretly, covertly performed illegal service. That's such a complicated legal jumble mumble that I'm so glad I'm not an attorney, and I'm so sorry to all the attorneys out there. So I just kind of wanted to talk about how how those three concepts are really fluid and very complex in social and legal sense. Any comments?
I was just going to say something about earlier. So
yeah, go
like,
ahead.
it's not a monetary thing. It's not specific value in wealth or anything, but the symbol of giving, and it's not an expectation of, oh, I will get the same amount back, whatever. I've witnessed that myself in some interesting ways. Like one of the most selfless acts, the most generous acts that I've ever received was begging for gas money outside of Shasta, California. And a woman with probably less than I had, she gives me her last $20 bill and says, oh, don't worry, I'll get another job, I'll get more. And I was just like, wow, that is incredible. And so, like, if I had lots and lots of money, the equivalent for me doing that would be like, oh, here, have my bank card. Go ahead and go to that ATM, empty it out. Don't worry, I'll get more.
That's kula right there. That's not kula, but say the word for me, potlatch, right? That's the idea of giving away everything to the last penny. Just a couple other things that I'm not going to go in about gifts. There's two other things that I thought about that have to do with gifts. One is when a gift is, for example, wedding ring, right? Slave's collar. A grivna, which is a neck collar decoration that warriors used to give to soldiers in their command and their herd. When a gift is a sign of, for example, a cross that a mother takes off her neck, or a woman who loves a warrior takes off her neck and puts on his neck, right? When a gift becomes a symbol of protection, possession. So it's a mark. So the gift becomes a part of you that you're marking the other person with, right? And the other aspect of it is the idea of sacrifice in every sense. And that's where the idea of potlatch kind of even more is relevant. The idea of that you're giving away so much that it's almost like, when we talked about the legends that like the leader of the Phoenicians, settled her people and then walked up onto the pyre and just killed herself, right? So I'm not going to, it's a complex subject, but there's that sacrificial aspect to giving away everything. It's very similar to sacrificing your firstborn. It's almost like giving your life in a way, because again, items are not things, they're not material. It's not consumerism, it's a part of you. And just my last finishing story, because I want to really tell you guys the scary story. So we have the triad with hospitality. Again, food, exchange of things that represent you, and bathing, right? In a lot of cultures, bathing is very crucial. Last episode, we talked about the wonderful Baba Yaga character in Russian folklore, who is this scary half-dead creature that's gateway person between the forest or the wilderness and the people's world, right? So usually what happens, you have a brave young, what's the English word for that? How would I translate it? Worthy youth warrior riding up on his smart horse, who is a magical creature. He rides up to this, remember I showed you a little cartoon, house on chicken legs, turn your back to the forest and your front to me, right? The house turns around, this little old lady comes out, she's like, I can smell living flesh, I want to eat you, right? And customarily in every fairy tale, that warrior, that young lad, he says, Baba Yaga, you can't eat me, I'm a guest. Feed me, wash me, let me sleep. And it's a custom. Even though she's a representation of the other side, she can't go against that way because she's between the worlds, right? And the moment that she does those things with her visitor, she can't harm him anymore. And after that, usually in the fairy tale, the Baba Yaga, the scary witch type character that's supposed to eat people's, is now suddenly helping the main character because they broke bread, because they have, done the sacred exchange. Usually there's some sort of item exchange, and because of the washing is essential. Now, what do all those kind of rituals, what is really hospitality about? We talked about last time, it's about the idea of thresholds, right? What do you need to do to cross a threshold, a traditional culture? Always you die and you're reborn. It's initiation in a way, right? A child who comes into this world, until they reach a certain age, in a lot of cultures, they don't have a name because it's in between worlds, right? A dead person, until proper ceremonies have been conducted over the dead person, is in between worlds. It's that border state that when you don't know who are you theirs or are you one of us, right? Hospitality is all about helping the other person cross that threshold. And washing is very much an aspect of that, because the idea of washing in every culture, to wash off your sins, right? Baptism by water, sacred rites in almost any culture that has anything to do with water. In Slavic tradition, for example, in Russian archaic tradition, birth is given in a bathhouse. Now, in the Scandinavian tradition, we have sauna. In Slavic tradition, we have banya. There's some differences between the two about how it's done. One is more wet, the other one is more dry heat, but it's a bathing house that stands outside of the main living. It's not the house that people live in. It's an anti-house. It's a very scary place because it is a gate place between the world of us, of peoples, and it's the world of the other. I want to show you just really quickly a picture. So what a banya looks like. Banya is an anti-house because this is inside of a Russian banya. So it's a house that's lacking very important aspects. It's lacking that bread making oven. Now it has a source of heat that you create the steam from. It's also lacking another very important aspect. We talked about what a house is and kind of the representation of the universe within the house. In Russian village houses, there used to be such thing as the red corner. Nowadays, the red corner oftentimes is where you would hang your icons or photos of your loved ones on. It's the sacred corner of the house. It's the thing that makes that house blessed by the spirits. It's the thing that makes the people space safe for the people. Now, banya or sauna, it doesn't have that sacred blessed place. And like a lot of other environments that are kind of borderline in kind of folkloric tradition, it is inhabited by a character that is specifically assigned to banya and banya only. It is one of the scariest characters in Russian folklore. Now, there's a house spirit in Russian folklore, which is also a representative of the other world, right? But it's mostly benign. It's mostly a friendly character unless you really upset it. Bannik, or saunik, as I would call it, is a creature that is the spirit that lives in this anti-house, the house that's lacking the blessing of the gods. And that's why people go there. Every time you wash yourself, it's a miniature death. It's a miniature rebirth ritual. That's why that triad goes together. You share food, life, you're born, you consumed, or you consume, you're reborn, initiation thing. You exchange parts of your soul in a way that's also blood bonding ritual, right? And the bathing, again, you wash off the otherness from your guest, and now that guest is one of you and you cannot harm them. So if you guys want to hear a scary story as the finishing of this little thing, and this is not a scary story from ancient times. This is a scary story that was actually gathered by an ethnographer, Russian ethnographer by the name of Baranov, in very recent expedition to the far north of Russia. And this is a story that he heard from an old man in a village that he interviewed. That's how scary of a creature the spirit of the wash house is. So there goes the story. This young man, he's an ethnographer, Baranov. He is sitting next to an old guy, and the guy is telling him something that happened in his family about 15 years ago. He says, we had a big family gathering. We had a family reunion. A bunch of my relatives came from, all around other villages. And my married daughter, she came from the city. And she got here pretty late for whatever reason. And she was sweaty from the road. She's like, Dad, I'm going to go wash up real quick in the bathhouse. Now, in the bathhouse, there's important things because the spirit of the bathhouse is the master of the bathhouse. You don't break certain rules. Nighttime, you don't go into the bathhouse. It's the time of the other side. And there's such thing as the third steam. So there's usually 3 steams in a bathhouse. First, the men wash themselves, right? That's the first steam. Second steam, you heat it up again, women and children. Third steam, nobody goes in there because that's your donation, that's your sacrifice to the spirit of the bathhouse. Well, this lady, she went in on the third steam and after dark. Her dad tried to talk her out of it. She's like, Dad, don't worry. She's from the city. She's like, don't worry, I'll be 15 minutes. I just want to freshen up, right? And this old man is telling the story. He says, I had grandchildren and everything else. We were getting the table set, kind of forgot about it. And then he realized it's been at least an hour. And he says, my heart just started beating. And he got other men in the family. They took flashlights. They walked into the bathhouse. They started looking for the daughter. When they opened the door, the steam was so hot that it was like they couldn't breathe, right? So you're looking at the layout of this bathhouse, and the shelves is where usually they're stacked up, they go up, down. It's where you lay to kind of get sweaty and stuff. They look, it's dark. They don't have electricity. They're looking inside. They can't see her anywhere, right? Well, when you walk into the bathhouse, where we're looking through the door right now, there's hooks that are hanging over the door right here in the corner where people are supposed to hang their clothing, when they undress. And they looked, and this is the story. He turns around and they look at the hooks, and he says that they about died because she broke that taboo, because she entered the place of this very not benign spirit at the time when it was not right for the humans. He says, we look at the hooks, and there hangs her hair and skin, and below it is a pile of bones. This is not a guy making up a story, okay? This is not a case of a person hallucinating, because the ethnographer then, he went around, started talking to his neighbors to find out what happened, right? And they're like, yeah, his daughter did wind up dying somehow in the bathhouse about 15 years ago. What really happened? Nobody probably knows. But that fear, that taboo, that memory is so strong that when this old man was telling the story of his own personal loss, his own personal tragedy, it's what he saw. It's what was real to him. That's kind of the power of these spirits. It's the power of these prohibitions. And that's the strength of these almost innate, almost instinctual connections that are built on exchange of gifts. You know what I'm saying? If you do things a certain way, then you treat it like a human being, you have humanity. If you go against the grain, it's taboo, you're punished, and you're exiled horribly from the human world. And I guess that's what I kind of wanted to get to with all of this. If anybody has any thoughts or comments, I'd love to hear them. Boo!
That was quite a story. Very interesting.
Yeah, interesting topic. Gift giving. I know the Navajos, we're not really into the potlatch thing, but if we have extra stuff, we will give it out if a person needs it. Like a medicine man, in the old days, he used to get a lot of stuff for payment for his ceremonies. And back then, you didn't ask for a price. The patient just gave what they had. Sometimes they're poor and they can't give a lot, but sometimes they're wealthy and they give a whole bunch of stuff. But then the medicine man, in turn, if there's anybody in need in the community, he would just give that out. So a lot of, there's a lot of, in the old days was a ceremonial context for giving food or gathering together.
Right. And unfortunately, right now, we're moving more and more into the society where that ceremonial context is out the window. Everything has dollar signs to it or whatever others, yang signs or whatever else signs. And the human society is starting to kind of
in the military. We had a sports equipment we had to go to, and so we were changing in the change rooms by the gym. And one of the guys who's a Cree, he had quite a nice watch that was stolen, and he was livid. He said if the guy wanted it so much, he should have just asked me. I would have given it to him, and he meant it. He would just give stuff out like that. But to steal from somebody was completely bad. To ask for it, another story.
Right.
Yeah, that's kind of how it is here. A friend of mine was recently ripped off a couple of weeks ago, and what really floors a lot of us is that it's like this guy just gives things away constantly. My family gives him gifts, he gives us gifts, big gifts too. I mean, cars, engines, pieces of expensive metal, you name it. And it's like, well, you know, if these people had just gone up to him and asked him, it's like, hey, do you need all of your chainsaws, your log splitter, whatever, or, you know, can I have them, or can I at least use them? He would have said, yeah, sure, go for it. Why not? I'm not using it right now. But the gall to actually steal, that is what really tears it up.
Right. Okay, guys, where do we want to go next? Next podcast. We could do Etruscans. With horrid trepidation, I could attempt to do China.
That's the farmer the hunter gatherers turning into farmers. We're about there in history, so China is definitely gotta look at it.
At some point in time, we have to do ancient Judea too. Brr, terrification much.
That's a few thousand years later, though.
I know. Well, no, not really, because early stages were kind of contemporary. Very, 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 very early stages of that. But so what do you guys think? China, Etruscans, China, or something else entirely?
Well, I think China is before the Etruscans, so.
Okay, China it is.
China Neolithic.
No, China, because China is a whole separate world. I mean, we're going to be doing China for a long time once we get there.
Right.
So, okay, guys, then it's China. It is.
Sounds good. Excellent to see everybody. Everybody be well.
You guys are amazing. Thank you for your support and participation. It means a lot. It really does.
You're
Thank
amazing,
everybody.
Julie. You put this together.
See you guys. Bye.
That exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.